Well, Krystal, the saga of It Ends With Us, starring Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, has officially crossed the threshold from a story of celebrity intrigue to one of greater import. I think it's really becoming a story about the media. And to be fair, we always could see a little bit of the internal Hollywood PR machinations creeping into public view over the course of the last several months since the movie came out, and they famously did not promote the movie together. But it has since, just in the last even 48 hours, become a sort of post-Me Too story about how the media is handling allegations of sexual misconduct. Essentially, it's becoming a fascinating story, but I think a really important one. One of the reasons that I love following celebrity gossip so closely, Krystal, is because it's a low-stakes public relations game, and you see how journalists, and in this case, we're talking about the New York Times. We're not talking about TMZ. We're not talking about Pop Sugar or whatever else. We're talking about the New York Times, how easily they can be manipulated by powerful people in the public relations game. So right now it's sort of a question of who's a jerk, Justin Baldoni or Blake Lively, and maybe the answer to that question is both of them. But just yesterday, Variety published a story that I'm going to share on the screen right now because this is a hugely significant story in that it is quite a rebuttal to a New York Times story that really took Blake Lively's side. So this is the headline from Variety. Justin Baldoni files $250 million lawsuit against New York Times over Blake Lively's story, saying it relied on her, quote, self-serving narrative. Now, again, Krystal, I don't think we needed Justin Baldoni to file this suit to realize that it was relying on Blake Lively's narrative. Let me share the New York Times story right now. You can see we can bury anyone inside a Hollywood smear machine. That had the byline, or you may recognize that byline, viewers and listeners may recognize this byline, Megan Twohey, who was one of the famous New York Times Me Too reporters, very celebrated for Me Too reporting in the initial wave of the Me Too movement. And I don't know about you, Krystal, but as I was reading through the original New York Times story, it seemed to me, just as a casual reader who hadn't looked at any of these documents, that there was a huge context gap, that a lot of the producers' texts that were being published, so the one that's in the headline, it says, quote, "We can bury anyone." We were missing a lot of other parts of those conversations. So the New York Times is making it look as though Justin Baldoni had realized that Blake Lively was not happy with him and was going to run her own kind of campaign against him. Obviously, millions and millions of dollars are on the line anytime you're promoting this. It's like a big product, essentially. And so it means a lot to bottom lines for these big companies. And they treat it really seriously. And that's where celebrity gossip becomes a product in and of itself as well. So. Right. Yeah, and these allegations are that Baldoni was walking in on Blake Lively while she was breastfeeding, allegations that he bit her lip during a kissing scene, basically that he acted like a jerk. Nothing here, I think, constitutes like assault, obviously, but he was also sort of walking around clothing himself as in the sort of like moral garb of male feminism. Yes. So then it's like he seems to be orchestrating, or his people seem to be orchestrating, a social media campaign to take clips of Blake Lively and disseminate them and make it look like an organic uprising of people realizing that Blake Lively has always been sort of a jerk. And then he comes in with this lawsuit against the New York Times and gives evidence to Variety suggesting the New York Times, believe it or not, Krystal, was overly gullible. And a lot of people would look at that more cynically and say was, taking is like some type of orders from Blake Lively for something in return. But I think what it looks like is they got drip, drip, drip bits from Blake Lively's team and did not confirm the context, or were ideologically sort of wedded to the Lively narrative and to her side of the story, that they weren't interested in the other context. Because what Baldoni is doing, I don't think he may get a settlement. You're not going to win, I think, this suit against the New York Times. And as a journalist, I don't think he should win the suit against the New York Times, because they're free to publish whatever nonsense they want to, and we're free to say that it's nonsense. But it looks like some of these things, at least from a journalistic standpoint, would have been served by better context. And so the question now becomes whether the New York Times had that context. So Krystal, what do you make of what we learned yesterday?
Yeah, so just to back up for people who are like me and we're not really following the story outside of my 16-year-old being like, oh my God, Mom, what do you think about this? I'm like, what do I think about it? I don't even know about it. Who's Blake Lively?
There was a lot of TikTok.
That's where I had to start with is like, who is Blake Lively and who is Justin Baldoni? That was where I had to start with all of this. But effectively, they're co-stars on this movie. It ends with us.
Yeah.
Okay. Movie. And the movie, one of the central themes also is around domestic violence. So that's how Justin Baldoni comes to like cloak himself in this like, I'm an ally and I'm against toxic masculinity. And he's doing a podcast with Liz Plank, who's noted feminist, etc. So he adopts this whole mantle. And during the promotion for this film, neither one of them, they won't appear together. And also, the entertainment media picks up on the fact that a bunch of cast members have unfollowed him. So there seems to be some rift between him and everyone else. So then, according to, some of the texts that have been released, he starts to panic of like, obviously, she's not happy. They're not happy with us. Like, they could really smear us in the press. What can we do to get ahead of that? And I think even without, some of the ways that the Times characterized it, obviously, like they screwed up, right? Like, for example, that quote, about we could bury anyone, et cetera, left out the emoji that would have indicated to readers that they were being sarcastic.
Right.
And they also left out a text that indicated directly that this PR team was actually not responsible for this specific article that appeared. But nevertheless, even putting that aside, he enlisted PR professionals to basically try to get ahead of the story and flip the narrative. So at some point, there seems to be this online organic, like, we don't like Blake Lively and she's kind of a bitch and she was a bitch in this interview. And why is she just out there promoting her like alcohol company when, alcohol can be linked to domestic violence and she doesn't talk about domestic violence at all. There seemed to be this organic anti-Blake Lively narrative that took hold in the public. And so when she gets her side of the story out in this New York Times piece, she alleges, with the aid of the New York Times, that effectively, like, number one, you were inappropriate on the set in any number of ways. You mentioned a few of them coming into my trailer when, at different times when I was naked. There were some allegations of like body shaming. She just had a baby. There were allegations that there were different boundary violations, and they had sex scenes in this movie. So, it's very fraught, and she's married, and her husband apparently berated Baldoni at one point. So in any case, she alleges that happened, and that there's this orchestrated campaign of retaliation against her. Okay. So
and
now,
Krystal, I'm just going to put up on the screen here. You can see from Variety as an example, one of the juiciest tidbits from the New York Times story was this allegation that Baldoni had basically stormed in on Blake Lively while she was breastfeeding on the set of the movie, and versus the Variety story that I know you were just about to get to, which says, well, the context there, they have text messages of Blake Lively saying, I'm just pumping in my trailer if you want to work out our lines, and Baldoni saying, copy, eating with crew, and we'll head that way.
So effectively, from these texts, it's like, oh, she was like, come on over. I'm just here, like, pumping, meaning breast milk, in my trailer. If you want to work out our lines, like, come on over. And
or at the very least, that context should have been in the New York Times story. Right. So maybe he still barged in or whatever. And maybe there are more text messages saying, knock before you come in, or whatever. But it sounds like that should have been in the New York Times story.
Right. And then another instance where there was missing context was, they say in the New York Times story that she alleges he showed her a naked video of his wife, which, like, that's like, what are you doing there? And it turns out, not that I still wouldn't be really cool with this, but it turns out the naked video was of her during a home birth. So, like, the least sexual connotation or context for a nude video that you could possibly get, that also left out of the New York Times piece. So he had his little PR campaign, which was successful in sort of turning the public against her. Then she fires back with this New York Times story that the New York Times was far too credulous about at best, at worst, like actively hid and manipulated some of the things that would be more favorable towards him. And now he's firing back with this lawsuit, which also you have to assume, right? It's his lawsuit. This article is based on his side of the story, is also likely cherry picking and leaving out some of the less flattering details for him as well. So some of the core themes here are, number one, like, he went out and draped himself in very intentionally, like that was part of the PR campaign, drapes himself very intentionally in this, I'm an ally of women. I'm like, I'm against toxic masculinity. I'm going to speak out against it. You should never harm women, blah, blah, blah. He's doing this as part of a PR campaign to undermine this very specific woman. So you've got that aspect. Mm-hmm. Then you have her basically engaging in some of the same behavior in the media, credulously picking it up. So you have that aspect. And then, of course, you just have, the whole specter of the way these two individuals, who are human beings, yes, but also brands with a whole circle of people invested in their brands, who are waging like PR wars against each other. And, the public is being manipulated in any number of ways. And I think that part is very real. And also, like, to go and even layer deeper, and we're about to talk about OpenAI and some of these AI stuff, like, one of the possibilities here is even that chatbots were potentially wielded in this war between Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively. And it does just make you, like, this is kind of, it's not that consequential of a story, ultimately, what happened on the set between these two individuals. But it does also make you question, like, how much of what we're being fed by the media, fed on social media, like these, interactions that appear to be real and appear to be organic, how much of this is already just fake, already just, astroturfed, already just completely concocted by somebody for some reason to manipulate you and your perception of reality. And to me, that's like the most kind of like dystopian angle of this, is that we really don't know how much of what we're already consuming on the web and in media is real, and how much is just literally generated like falsely out of whole cloth.
That's why this is damning for the New York Times, because if there's something that should stand between smear campaigns, information operations, and the public, it's the free press. And for the New York Times, they're defending it and saying, but they didn't defend any specifics, to be clear, but they said, we stand by our reporting. But this is a celebrated Me Too reporter at the New York Times, who seems to have been, at the very least, taken for a ride by the extremely powerful public relations team of Blake Lively that, I guarantee you, weaponized the reporter's Me Too connections and feminist bona fides against them, and for the benefit of the Blake Lively smear campaign. And we started this just by talking about how entertainment media is often just like a lower stakes example of what happens in political media.
Yeah.
So if you imagine, remember, a lot of people probably do, like you were talking about your daughter, these clips of Blake Lively going viral around the premiere of It Ends With Us. Their allegation is that Baldoni, sort of his team, whether or not he knew about it is a different question, but his team astroturfed this viral momentum against Blake Lively by sort of creating accounts or feeding accounts these old videos. And we actually have one right here that we'll go ahead and roll for everyone just for a taste, because a lot of people probably remember seeing this stuff go viral at the time, but here we go. This is an interaction that Blake Lively had.
Congrats on your little bump.
What about
Okay, so that was just like a short clip, but it was being used to say like, oh, look at Blake Lively gets congratulated by a reporter on her baby bump, and then turns it back around on the reporter, like,
and is basically like, you're fat.
Yeah, it seemed Krystal like not a very kind thing to do. And
yeah, well, but then here's where things get even more, again, complicated. That particular, I guess she's like an entertainment reporter, YouTuber, whatever. Her last name, I think she's Norwegian. Her last name is like Fla. There's also a question about what her incentives were in resurfacing this interview, because she resurfaced this and did this whole like the interview that made me want to quit my job, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And she also had been very much pro Johnny Depp in the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial and that whole drama. And lo and behold, Baldoni and Depp repped by the same PR agents. Yep. So now she denies that. She says she did this organically, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, there's a question there, too, of whether or not she had some incentives. And maybe those incentives were just like, oh, I've built this particular audience, and here's a way that I can, you know, like get in on a similar storyline that may have a similar hook, etc. But this is also a potentially motivated actor in this whole thing as well. Yep. So, yeah, these things that can seem like they just sort of like organically popped out of the ether and there's some public reaction against it. It's like, well, did that really happen? Or did you really have like an army of bots and some highly motivated influencers and credulous journalists to push a particular view of the world that may or may not be accurate?
So on that exact point, we were going to talk about this story before the Variety exclusive on Baldoni's lawsuit dropped, because the New York Times piece was so conspicuously fed by Lively's team. And that doesn't mean that Lively is wrong and that Justin Baldoni is a jerk or a saint. It doesn't mean any of that. What it means is that you could see in the sort of anatomy of the New York Times piece that it was coordinated by a public relations team on behalf of Blake Lively because it was so conspicuously missing context. And again, that's fine if you are a feminist Me Too reporter who wants to stand with Blake Lively and that's just your opinion. You've reviewed the text messages the team sent, you've asked the questions you feel are relevant, whatever, fine, go ahead and do it. But don't do it and act like this is the, you know, objective or the most neutral version of the story if you're leaving out context or not asking questions that would help you ascertain that context that is being conspicuously hidden from you by Lively's team. And again, to Krystal's point, these are multi-billion-dollar businesses. These are important, like the celebrity stuff, it's lower stakes obviously than politics, but it's important to their bottom lines, the health of their companies, to their shareholders. And so they treat this stuff like it's widgets. They treat these human interactions like they're widgets. And the actors all know that. The actors are investors, they're a part of that. They're producers, executive producers, so they play the game. They understand what they are in all of this. They're making a lot of money off of it. But now put this to politics, and it's maddening to watch, to see stories like this about any given topic. Like Krystal, from your perspective, the New York Times coverage of Gaza, or from my perspective, the New York Times coverage of any immigration story, or something dumb that Trump said. Like you can just see, the fingerprints. The cheap fake stories were a great example ahead of the debate about how the Republican Party was circulating these cheap fake videos. You could see in the New York Times coverage at the time the fingerprints of the Biden White House and the DNC on those stories. And you have that perspective when you're in media and you do this for your job. But this is the best example. If you're a member of the public and you want to see how the media can manipulate truth and information, read both of these stories and it'll be really eye-opening.
Yeah. And the thing is, okay, so even if you took out, or even if you included the context that the Baldoni people say was missing of she was being sarcastic here. And they actually said one text earlier that they weren't responsible for this story, but they kind of wish they were, even if you added all that context, it still doesn't look good for him. It's still a story. Yeah. It still very much paints a picture of he was worried that she was going to say some bad things about him. So he cloaks himself in this whole I'm the women's ally and I'm against toxic. He cloaks himself in all of this, runs around talking about, pretending like he really cares about domestic violence. And meanwhile is launching this PR campaign of retaliation against her. Even if you add the context, that is all very clear. It's just they wanted it to be a less nuanced and more clear-cut indictment of him. They wanted the quote about "we can bury anyone" to stand on its own without having the supporting context, et cetera, et cetera. And by doing that, by reaching further than what was, organically there and honest, as best we can tell at this point in this story, they really end up undercutting her. Because now people can just say, well, look, you didn't include that. So obviously this is just a hatchet job. Like, it's just bullshit. Where I don't think it is all just bullshit. Like, I think the basic contours of she was unhappy with him. He wanted to get ahead of it. He launched this PR campaign of retaliation again. Like, I think that is all true. I don't think that's really deniable at this point. But because they wanted to go that extra mile and really paint him in this sort of like one-dimensional villainous way, they end up overreaching and undercutting their entire story. So, but not that I think they'll learn any lessons from this. They won't, but anyway.
No, but big question to come is what the New York Times saw. And if this suit proceeds, we will learn a lot more about Krystal.
And the discovery process could be interesting.
Yes, and sadly, the winner from all of this might be Harvey Weinstein, who is able to then say, as egregious as what he clearly did was, that, this is the same thing to your point, Krystal. Like, some of these stories can be real and newsy, and then because the media does such a bad job with them, they end up undercutting actual victims.
True.
Yeah, so there's much more to come from this, to be sure, and it's more than celebrity gossip at this point.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.